Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another open office session from the new Energy Nexus. Today is a really important session we're going to have with a really good old friend of mine, Jeff Berkland. Today is April 9th, 2020. We are in the beginning stages of the pandemic COVID-19 crisis. And today is going to really be focused on what a CFO or what a CEO playing a CFO in a small startup, clean economy company should be thinking about and what they should be doing immediately to help them survive and ultimately thrive out of this very desperate financial time. So let me just get started here by getting the clicker going. There we are. Okay, just as a reminder, New Energy Nexus is a 15-year-old 501c3. Throughout our history, we've mobilized over $1.5 billion in capital to support clean economy entrepreneurs transition our entire economy to non-carbon. And our main focus is really around diversity, women in entrepreneurship, people of color from regions that are not traditional. And we're now a global organization across the United States and throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia and China. Our main tenets of activity are focused on launch, fund, accelerate, and scale. Today, we're going to be talking about survival, which is also part of our curation in the accelerate portion of what we're doing. Open Office really sits in the fund and accelerate and scale portion of our work, and it's really been a great tool for us. Mission is to support diverse entrepreneurs to drive innovation and build equity into the global clean economy. And we're always in support of the entrepreneur. That is our customer per se. And they take all different forms and shapes. And we love that fact because we then can seek the 100% for 100% of the people. Open Office, just as a reminder, is a program of the New Energy Nexus, which is really one-on-one coaching sessions and mentor sessions for our funded companies traditionally, but we are now opening that service up to any clean economy company around the globe that would find a one-on-one coaching and mentoring session helpful to survival or hopefully scaling and thriving. So it's the Open Office also includes a lot of digital material. This is an example of some of that digital material that we're going to share globally to all of our friends and partners. And what we typically focus on are things around decision-making, leadership, culture building, strategy, and of course, finance. We also encourage folks to join our Slack channel because it really puts people in touch with our work on a day-to-day basis. If you want to schedule an open office session, please go write an email to Jessica and she'll get you on the schedule. So I have the pleasure today of welcoming an old friend of mine, Jeff Berkland. We've known each other probably a decade and a half. I'm grateful for that. We've worked together directly and indirectly on Empower Micro, a company that I founded and funded, and also Principal Power, a company I founded and funded. I was also very lucky to work with Jeff's wife at one point quite intensely on Principal Power, which is now seeing some incredible success. My experiences as an entrepreneur and an investor and a director. So let me introduce Berkland, which is a part-time CFO organization in primarily the Bay Area, but has been super active in helping companies during this time. Jeff's background is, Duke undergrad, mechanical or electrical engineering? I've forgotten. Electrical engineering. So that's quite a feat. And then he went to University of Oxford for a period of time and then finished off his schooling at Harvard Business School. So Jeff, please welcome to Open Office and today's special session.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. I'll do a quick introduction of Berkland as well. And I will also say, John, I've really enjoyed our knowing each other and the relationship's been awesome. So to give a little bit more background on Berkland, We are a internal finance organization. So like John said, we provide part-time CFO support, as well as accounting, including controlling and bookkeeper support, as well as taxes to startups. So our typical customer is anywhere from a seed stage customer, there are quite a few of those, through to about Series C, venture funded or typically going to be venture funded companies. We currently have just over 200 active clients in that space. And I'd also like to add that I've asked Steve Lord here to join us. Steve leads our CFO knowledge share team. He's been heavily involved in our thinking about how to respond to this crisis, as well as a lot of what's come out of the stimulus plans. Steve also is a CFO himself on the team and helps several clients as well.
Super. Thanks, Steve, for joining us here today. I understand you're coming to us from New York area, so
That's
I hope
right.
you're
Thanks.
keeping yourself isolated and safe, and your
Oh,
family as
yes.
well.
Thank
Good.
you.
Thanks
Happy to
for
be here.
joining.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Well, Jeff, let's jump right in. Today's session is really about what are the absolutely critical things that a CEO can either do themselves or ask of their CFO themselves to give themselves a better chance of surviving this moment, because it really is an enormous amount of financial pressure. We understand that the private equity markets are quite frozen up. Obviously, the commercial engagements that are possible are also, well, people are being very conservative, let's say it that way. So what can these CEOs do?
I'm sure. Thanks, John. So we've put together 5 key steps that we think CEOs and CFOs should do, and in fact that we're doing ourselves for our clients. And I want to run through several of them. The first one and 2 kind of key off of what is clearly an understatement at this point, but times have changed, right? Everything needs to be reevaluated. What we've done with our clients that have revenue, and sort of to put it into perspective, is take a look at the financial model and say, okay, what if revenue takes a 20% hit? What about 35%? What about 50%? And just to put some perspective, some companies have had a 100% hit of revenue, have completely lost revenue.
Wow.
Even $1 million, companies with millions in revenue have completely lost everything from a revenue perspective for now. So it's not a unreasonable assumption to say what would happen if I lost 50% of revenue.
Yeah, I agree there. I agree there. In fact, just a corollary, I was speaking with a private equity investor yesterday, and he said that the price of timber has fallen by 48% over the last 3 weeks. And I thought to myself, wow, what an interesting data point, but that's an incredible drop in price. Now we're talking about revenue here, but even so, obviously the price is a relation to revenue numbers and demand. So I'm completely in agreement with you that I would even push to maybe 65% testing of your models to understand where you'd be with that kind of stress.
And even if it hasn't hit yet, there's a lot of reasons why it could still come. And so businesses, I've talked with a client of ours that sells to enterprise customers, big enterprise customers. So far, it doesn't appear that they've been hit. But it could very well come, because think about the cascade of effects as consumers slow their spending down. It eventually cascades through to enterprises that start to get hit, start to focus on profitability more, and will be less willing to try startups.
In your crystal ball, because you have such an enormous footprint of being embedded as a CFO temporarily or eventually permanently, what is your forecast on how long this might last? Assuming that we take good practices socially across the nation, which is not currently the case, but let's assume for a minute that everyone did just go for a 4-week shelter in place, and we did knock down the curve. Where do you see? Because that puts us the second week of May. If we all just did that today, which is not the case, but are we talking about a recovery even before the end of the year?
So I think I'll answer that in a few ways. One is specific to this, startup community that we're in, and I was in a board meeting about a week and a half ago when we were talking about this enterprise company. So remember that this company hasn't even had their revenue hit yet. And the board members, we were having a discussion about how much cash do we think the company needs to have, right? And universally, the 3 board members, several of which have experience having gone through prior downturns, said we need 24 months of cash. At the very least, 18 months of cash in the company now to make it through, to expect to be able to make it through. Now that's impacted by the lag it takes VCs to start funding new companies again. Their assumption was that the economy will start recovering in about 4 quarters, 2 to 4 quarters, but that there will be a 4-quarter lag before VCs start funding again. That's what their assumption is. Now, your question is like, how soon do we start recovering? And I think about that sort of general economy, not just startups. And I think it's becoming less and less likely that it'll be a V. That's the common sort of, are we going to recover fast, or is it going to be a U shape and it's going to take us time? But lots of companies are taking serious damage right now, and even companies that are not clearly impacted, like retail companies, sure, those are clearly impacted. But like, I've talked with a doctor who has his clinic. It's a big size clinic. They make about $4 million a month. That clinic is down to $400,000 in revenue a month right now. Yeah, now, clearly they're not doing COVID probably, but they're sort of all sort of elective surgery is gone. And so like, there are other areas you may not necessarily think of for consulting, strategic consulting's out. And so what happens is those companies start to lay people off, and then when the businesses start to recover, they can't just go from 0 to 100 right away. It takes them a little while to get people back, start training again, start getting people back in the flow. All of this is gonna take a while. So the most likely, I think, is we're talking about a year. But I mean, it is also very hard to predict.
Your point about the early stage venture investors returning in 18 months according to that party, and maybe 24 months. That's a very good point to tease out here, in that early stage venture dollars are usually the last ones returned to the field, and they're the first ones off the field. So I think that our CEOs need to be prepared for the fact that early stage venture may not return for 12 months. And so they need to skinny up, and they need to do the things as you're suggesting here around, pressure testing their revenues if they have revenues. And if not, then the very next line is really important. You have to decide what is truly critical and what's optional, right? I mean, I'm just looking at this and saying you're so in sync.
Yeah, and I know many of the companies in New Enterprise group is small and doesn't have revenue, but then expenses, like you said, become incredibly important to look at. Can the company make it 12 months? Can the company make it 18 months? Do the founders and everybody need to go to minimum salary? Can there be delays in payment of rent or other areas of expenses? What if things get really nasty and it will take 18 months? What are the thoughts around how to make it till then? Are there moves that can be made now that delay spending decisions for later? Now, this may not apply nearly as much to sort of seed stage companies, but one of the things we're doing in our companies is effectively freezing hiring for the next 2-3 months, right? All companies are used to growing right now. It's a huge lift just to get them to freeze hiring. But what happens when you freeze hiring is you create options for the future. You can hire in the future. You hire now, you reduce your options in the future because now you've got an expense.
Right.
So freeze hiring for 2 to 3 months. Know what you need to watch to tell you whether or not it's okay to open hiring again, like critical sort of pipeline measures, or maybe in the case of a company that doesn't have revenue, perhaps critical funding information. And then look for those measures, and when those measures hit, then maybe you can hire again.
Right. I think your advice here of doing the detailed analysis on critical and optional expenses and making those cuts immediately, because I love what you've said here. Revenue always falls faster than expenses. And speaking as someone who was running businesses during the 2001 crisis and the 2008 crisis, and both times different companies, you're 100% right. It's like it's shocking how fast you can get undressed. It's really just amazing. So please, anyone that's listening to this, parse your expenses, divide into critical and optional. Make sure the critical is a very small pile, because there's going to have to be a lot that's cut.
And it's smaller. That critical pile is smaller than most companies think, because most companies
Yes.
have been growing for a while and think that you've got to pay all these expenses. And in reality, if you really, really got pushed, you can cut a lot more than you think.
Give me an example of where you've seen a CEO be on the fence about, is this critical or optional? And it's clearly in your mind optional.
What I'd like to do now, this is the perfect time to bring Steve in and answer
Good.
that question, as well as what I think might be helpful would be to just list typical expense areas that we see, whether critical or option, are on the cutting board to look at.
Yeah, so thanks, Jeff. I mean, when a CEO is looking at critical versus optional, a lot of it ends up coming down to the shift in their framework, or the thinking that they've brought to that exercise anyway, because 3 weeks ago, a bunch of stuff probably would have been defined as critical. That is now maybe not going to be as critical when they're looking at the revenue decline that Jeff just mentioned, or this idea that revenue falls faster than expenses. If it's really going off the cliff, a whole bunch of stuff obviously becomes less critical when you're looking at survival versus thrive or grow and things like that. What we've done in the past is sort of throw everything on a bucket and ask yourself, okay, survivability option, like what is required for the business to hibernate, go into preservation mode, and then look at it through the lens of what is hard to spool back up again versus just make a phone call and you can start spending that money again when the smoke clears. We have a restaurant group that we work with where there's a logistical tail to getting food on a plate. So even if that person had a green light today to get back into business, it's going to take a little while. So you start looking at those expenses through a lens of, okay, how long will it take us to spool back up? And then obviously there's always the decision of, okay, how much can I push paying this stuff off versus cutting it? You mentioned rent earlier is a good example. Very often in this kind of environment, landlords are happy to keep a tenant versus kick a tenant out. So there's usually a lot of flex that's possible there. And everybody on the call should think about, okay, how good is the relationship with your landlord? Talk to them, tell them where you are, have a conversation, see if you can't push off some of those really larger expenses. Most small companies have HR and then rent and a couple other like major big ticket items. HR is obviously going to be the first place to go if it's the largest expense you have. And Jeff mentioned earlier, how low can founders go? Obviously, everybody with big equity stakes in businesses should be expected to step up here if they have to.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, Steve. And it's worth saying again, if someone has an equity stake, above 5%, should really be looking at taking a significant income haircut.
Yeah.
At this moment, I think.
And I could name a couple other areas to look at. One is, really scan through subscription services. And
An
for
example, like licensing.
Or, LinkedIn. Do you have LinkedIn Premium? Do you need
right.
LinkedIn Premium anymore? You're
Right.
probably not going to be hiring anytime soon.
Right. If you're using the recruiting manager and you're not hiring, then that can go. Right.
Yep.
Another area that I think is hard for, at the end of this, I'm going to get into founder and company psychology. But one that came up in that board meeting that I referenced was, the founder was asking about raises that they sort of had, in process. They were starting to think about raises for this year. And the board member, rightfully so, I believe, said, raises, what about a 25% cut all across the board, and you're lucky to have a job?
Have a job.
It's like, think more seriously about like the old world of like raises every year, hiring people, that is gone right now.
Yeah.
Like more like seriously, 25% cut in pay is probably where the market is right now. Maybe 50. You know, I mean, like
Wow.
seriously.
Depending on who you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
And
Well, let's jump
you
forward a
pointed,
little bit here. Just to keep us moving along. Tell me a little bit about the length of runway conversation here, which is very difficult. Obviously, you know, Jeff sitting in that board meeting was probably a very unpleasant one for the CEO because he was getting a bit of education, or her. I don't know if it was a him or her, but someone was getting an education there about the new world they're living in and having to navigate. Um, Talk me through a little bit your methodology around. Obviously, you've parsed your expenses, your revenues probably plummeting. You've done the cuts you need to do. Now you need to be able to identify that runway.
Right. I mean, for a CFO, sort of understanding runway is generally, to be honest, pretty easy, because we're looking at cash, and we can look at, you know, cash burn, you know, this last month, divide that by the amount of cash as one very, very simple way to look at length of runway. Another way is to, you know, if you have a model and you believe the model to be reasonably accurate, you can look at what the model says when the model says you're out of cash. So we're constantly iterating through that. So you can say, okay, I think I'm out of cash in 12 months. Oh shoot, I want 18 months. How can I do that? Or right now I'm running a model that says 20% revenue decline and I can get to 18 months. But what if we hit 50% revenue decline? What does that say? Maybe it says 8 months. And I say, well, I don't really want to have a scenario where I go only 8 months on 50% revenue decline. You know, what can I do to get to 18 months on revenue decline of 50%? And maybe it doesn't actually require action now, except for delaying hires, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the model assumes an increase in hires, but you can turn that on or off depending on the revenue.
Okay.
So it's a constant iteration too, right?
Mm-hmm.
As information comes in, you're kind of looking at the model and saying, okay, do I still believe my current model, or do I still believe my current thinking? And by the way, what about if it gets worse, like a lot worse? Then do I still believe my thinking? And do I think I have the ability to move if that occurs?
That's a good point about maneuverability, because really your runway is just determining your length or the sort of the amount of degrees you can turn. And that's a really good point. I mean, I've been put into a box before where it was very tight and it was not a pleasant experience at all. We managed to get the company sold in time, but it was not a great outcome. And I've been in the other situation where the box is enormous and expanding. So that is something as a CEO that I think that people are going to relate to, that amount of maneuverability that you're giving yourself with that information. You know, the information of where are my toggles, where's my sensitivities, find out where I can make those adjustments, critical versus optional, making those actions right now. Do not wait at all.
Right.
Make those cuts today.
Right.
And then you can get that runway dialed in and iteratively move that forward.
Right.
Let me go to the next thing, which is really what we're talking about here is talk to me about this. This is really meat and potatoes.
So we were kind of talking to most of these, and now this can behave a little bit like a checklist for the companies that are listening. You know, to the extent that there's cash, you know, check out AR. Can you pull in AR?
Accounts receivable. So just quickly, we're using some acronyms, which I want to just let's parse that out. Accounts receivable and accounts payable.
Yeah, thank you. So for our accounts receivable, and the third bullet kind of gets at that. If there are some that are not current, some people haven't been paying, get on the phone, call them, talk to them.
Yeah. Accounts receivable for the CEOs that don't know that's when you have someone that owes you money for a service or product that you've provided to them. And so your accounts receivable, what you're trying to do here, as Jeff is so accurately saying, hey, call them up and say, hey, can you pay me early, or pay me some fraction of that earlier than, you know, the 60 days net terms that we have. It's going to, you know, I can't supply you as a servicer. I can't be a good counterparty to you if I'm not alive. I mean, that's a reasonable thing to say to people that owe you money.
Yeah, you know, I think that's really important, John, what you just said. In some cases, even for us, sometimes you think, oh, I can't go ask for that money. But yeah, you gave them a
Yeah.
service, they owe it to you. It's perfectly reasonable.
Yep.
And sometimes it just takes a shift in mindset to say, of course they should pay me.
Yeah.
And like, there's no other option. Of course they should. And that shift changes everything. And then they're more likely to pay you because you've got that perspective. And personally, I think, of course they should pay you if you provided a good service. So there's a little bit of that perspective. And then AP, meaning accounts payable. That is like, people that the company have to pay, like your rent. It's kind of the reverse of you calling and asking for people to pay. Can you delay any payments, especially really, really large payments? Back to, the accounts
Right.
receivable, on the fourth bullet. It's also, I think, important to start to look at, can I bill earlier? Can I collect faster? Can I do not net 60 terms, but net 30 terms? Sometimes you can't, I get it. Some companies are really big, but a lot of times there's more flexibility than companies think. And then the last thing we started telling, yeah.
I was going to say, you and I have experienced this in real time where, small companies typically don't have that leverage with their service providers or their, product company providers. It's a little bit more difficult to have leverage over your supply chain per se, but certainly on your utilities, on your landlord, which are big expenses for a startup. Be in conversation. I think that you're in no position to just say, put your hands on your hips and say, I'm not going to pay you. Well, then you're going to get probably the same right back to you. Be collegial. We're in this together. Help each other. These kind of things can yield some really good results.
And you might even be able to do that with the really large suppliers too, as long as it's a collaborative discussion.
Yeah. And you've experienced that too with your clients too, right? Where the demeanor and the approach is sometimes very important to the outcome.
That's right.
Yeah.
John, great. I wanted to add one quick thing too. In this AR and AP conversation, remember that the folks that have been invoiced and haven't paid, they're going through this same exercise in a crisis. So if you don't pick up the phone and call and try to collect that invoice, they're more than happy to stretch paying you, right? And so one of the things that we've said to a lot of our clients in a crisis environment is you never want to be a bank. You don't want to be providing somebody interest-free financing unless you have really no other choice, because they're going through this exact same process and trying to figure out who they can stretch. So getting into that conversation earlier is just better all the way around.
Yes. I love that last bullet here. We have several companies right now that are closing rounds, which is really encouraging. It's amazing. I think it speaks to the value that those companies are creating. But in my experience, any deal that waits is a deal that spoils. And
especially now.
Yeah, especially now. And I really am glad you teased that out there, Jeff, because tell each CEO, close that round, even if it's less than you thought what you were going to get at less terms, whatever it is, just get it closed.
And don't let it get caught up in legal.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cause that is actually, that's the invisible thumb on the scale that you don't even know is there. Is your counterparty could be telling their legal staff to just slow roll this one.
And yeah, for sure. It's happening.
Yeah. It's got to be,
I know firsthand.
Yep. You got to set dates and you've got to say this, you're in or out and we're getting this done. And the wire transfer has to be in by Tuesday of next week kind of thing. I mean, I know it sometimes can be a bit barbaric, but this is survival mode.
Well, and though, to add to that, so to the extent some VCs are having their legal team slow things down, or even if they're just being usual on their legal side, they get to dig in a little more than they used to. And so where companies used to be able to push back on the legal side, you don't want to be pushing back very much anymore. You got to really, really be selective about any legal pushback. Most of the times the terms that companies push back on legally anyway don't really end up mattering. And at this point in time, they matter even less. And so I would encourage, don't let the legal side slow anything down if you can.
Great advice. Great advice. And thank you for that. I'm going to move us forward a little bit here. Carry on, boys. This is great.
Well, there was an earlier conversation that you had, John, earlier, I believe this week, around the CARES Act. So, what we would say is make sure to look at, disaster relief stimulus programs. There may be some local ones. There are some related to delaying payroll taxes. And then, of course, there's the Paycheck Protection Program that's in the CARES Act that you had your conversation on, John.
But there's much more than that. We've been working with Duke University. They've been putting together an incredibly good comprehensive grant and capital access list. It's ongoing, so they're constantly updating it. And your alma mater is really doing a great job with that. There's a link to that Duke work at that bit.ly address there. So hopefully people are going to go to that and get access to that information. Non-dilutive capital or concessionary capital at this moment is critical. So do access it for sure. And we did cover it. And Steve, you've done a lot of work on CARES at this point. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a bit of a rocky start, and we're reading a lot of media about how difficult it is and all that. But, we actually started hearing today some of these Paycheck Protection Program loans have started to fund from some of the larger banks. Yeah. Like Chase and B of A. So it's out there. It's happened. It's not been probably the easiest rollout I've ever seen, but it is very well intentioned, and it is going to work. It is going to end up helping companies maintain their payroll, provide coverage for the cost for the company to carry the employees, so that they don't do those furloughs or major layoffs that we were talking about before. I think one thing that's important to flare there is that we've also had conversations with CEOs where we've had to tell them, this is not go get your free money to fund your startup program. This is a Paycheck Protection Program. So it is important to understand it for what it is. Bear in mind too, there are regular disaster relief loans that have been around long before the Paycheck Protection Program was there. And those are also very important for startups to understand and see how they may be useful for them.
I have a little curiosity, and we are giving the advice of taking a full blown 2.5 average of your period, and then using all that capital and getting 100% forgiveness
100%.
During the 8 weeks.
Yes.
But it is just 8 weeks, 2 months out of a 18-month minimum period.
Correct.
CEOs have to recognize that this is not going to save their company. This
Correct.
is going to give
it's going
them,
to help.
It's going to help for sure. And we do suggest that they go for 100% forgiveness. Would you agree with that advice, or would you agree go subscale? Then they're holding a loan.
No. I would. I mean, if the offer is there and the legal requirements are there fulfilled, definitely. I mean, it's like picking up a check on the street, right? I mean,
2 months. It's picking up 2 months of life,
and for free, ideally, right? Now, the important thing there is to understand that there is an easy way to make sure all of this is going to be forgiven. When you get a loan, if you go to your bank and you fill out the application and you've gotten it all figured out, have the bank open a sub-account into which that capital can be deployed.
Good
then
advice.
Make sure you're paying your payroll, shift your payroll account. It's easy to do. Make sure you're paying salaries and rent and utilities out of that account. That way, when it comes time to show that you are entitled to the forgiveness, there's no question about what those funds were used for.
Great idea. So get a second account if you're doing a PPP, so that everything is absolutely in a module that you can just hand off to whoever needs to. Yeah,
it's
that's great advice.
Ring-fenced, and there's no muddying of the water.
Yeah. Jeff, finally, let's talk through how you are communicating with your own staff about what's happening and your investors and I mean, because obviously everyone's living through this moment. It's not, I mean, we as a nonprofit are also scrambling to do this same activity.
Sure, I'm happy to, John. One thing, if it's okay, I'd like to do at this point is kind of take a step back and frame things. And I think it's really important. And this kind of gets back to this board meeting that I've referred to. But it's important to understand what the culture of the business has been and what it needs to be now, and what the expectations of the business have been and need to be now. Generally speaking, and I know different businesses are different, and a seed company that's working on some product development could be a little different, but they've operated in this environment that is grow for the past 12 months. That's all years. That's all it's been, has been growth, right? And if you think about it, if you've been around before that time, like I have, you may not remember as well the previous times, maybe. If you haven't been around before that, I encourage you to really, really understand what happened before and what it means now. And in that board meeting, the investor. So this meeting was with a SaaS company, right? So the traditional metric for SaaS is that they triple after about 1 million in revenue. They triple the next year, double, 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 right? So their revenue sort of growth, it sort of looks like that, from 1 to 3, 3 to 9, and then they start doubling, 18, 36. He said that is gone now. If you get out of this flat, you've won.
Yeah.
That is, instead of tripling, try flat, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that's success. What does that do to the thinking in the business?
Mm-hmm.
So the business has been thinking, oh, I'm going to grow staff, I'm constantly growing, I'm constantly doing things. No, you're flat, right? You have to reframe the entire thought process. And even the CEO in this case is an optimistic CEO, like almost all CEOs are, right? So afterwards, this reframing was helpful for me, even though I've been through it before. I'm like, that's right, of course, we need to buy options. We need to be able to live, even though the company's revenue is doing reasonably well. So I sit down with the CEO, and in this case, they had a head of finance, so I'm behaving as an advisor. And we look at the model. This is the model that they've been iterating for a while. And I'm looking at the hires, and there's about 5 new hires in the next month. And I'm like, okay, do you need that hire? Yeah, the head of engineering says we need it. And I'm like, really? Can you defend that with your board member? Well, let me go talk to the head of engineering. I'm like, why don't you tell the head of engineering what's going to happen? The world has changed.
Yeah.
Now they did get down to, there were 2 people that they had already made hires for. It did make sense for them to hire, but they cut the other 3, at least for the next 2 months, until they could get perspective on their metrics. The world has completely changed, and the culture of the business needs to understand that, at least the CEO needs to understand that there's this embedded culture of growth, and they need to understand that they're trying to push against that right now. That's one point, one perspective. The other perspective, by the way, so I'm not all doom and gloom. This is also a huge opportunity to be looking for opportunities, right? Things have changed, and in change creates opportunities. So if one's frame of mind is on where is the opportunity, you can often see it, and you can often find that there's some really neat actions a business can take. So you asked about us. One thing that I'll say is, I believe we were early in communicating how seriously people need to take this. And I believe we were early in disseminating information on the CARES Act. Both of those actions were relatively new for us to take, to be that fast and nimble on doing that. And being that fast and nimble came because we were thinking about where's the opportunity. And we're looking for an opportunity to help. In neither of those cases were we trying to solicit or anything like that. Mm-hmm. We were simply trying to help, but we were looking for opportunities. And so I think it's important to look at opportunities.
Yeah. When you're thinking, from a humane perspective, this is an incredible shift, and people not only are going to die, but they're going to lose their livelihoods. And, we live in the Bay Area, which sometimes sits in a pretty tremendous emotional and mental bubble. But this is about real jobs being lost. This is about people in bread lines. This is going to create something that's never been seen before. And I'm so proud of you guys to getting out in front on being early, isolating, getting out in front on cares to help not only your customers, but now you're talking about it openly, like, hey, I just want to inform people, like help people make good decisions kind of thing. You don't have to be my customer. You just be anybody, creating some jobs and and putting food on people's tables. This is really the work. And that's good advice. Is opportunity here. It's all, you got to be careful. You got to do the steps that we've followed here, cut down fast, critical, optional, all these steps need to be taken. But in this moment is a time when, if you survive, you can be a leader.
That's
And
right.
you could maybe even do some acquisition activity. I mean, we hear about these, big, huge, multi-billion-dollar acquisitions and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But, bringing together a couple of interesting companies can be, just for equity swap, can be very fortuitous. I mean, look at X.com and PayPal. They ultimately became PayPal proper, but that was early days of mashup. No one was funded, early funding. People weren't sure where they were going, mid 90s, very similar time in some senses. I mean, obviously without the crisis, but yeah, I agree with you. This is a moment of survival, but also of keeping your eyes open as the CEO for opportunity.
So you asked me what I'm doing, and within Berkland, I'm communicating more often, and we
Does
are.
that come naturally to you, Jeff?
You
No,
know
no,
the answer to
it's a
that, right?
yeah, I know. I mean, listen, I know you well enough, but I wanted to talk to you about that because it's you have to develop new skills, right?
Right, right. So it just, in case it hasn't come out yet, it may not have here. No, does not come naturally to me, but I know it's necessary. And I lean on my team, Steve included, to tell me, hey, you need to get out there, and you need to have this kind of message, and that's great. I act. I also have known early on that in these cases you'd have to communicate often. So I listen to others to tell me what I need to do, and I also have acted to communicate more frequently, much more frequently than I used to.
What are you on,
Um,
like a weekly basis with your team?
that's
Okay,
right. Yeah,
that's
weekly
great.
email. Hmm.
Okay, that's good.
Um, and that's an all company email. I've also ramped up my involvement in Slack,
Good.
just to make sure I'm in there, in the flow, communicating, helping keep people communicating, that sort of thing. My executive team, there's a bit of an oversimplification, but effectively my executive team is communicating more frequently. We went from weekly 1.5-hour meetings to continuing the weekly 1.5 meetings, but adding 2 more a week, sort of quick 15, 30-minute check-ins. We have another group that's sort of built to move quickly, that is also meeting 3 times a week. So just like ramped up communication.
Okay, just good huddles though. They're not, sort of formal. They're stand-up meetings kind of thing.
Kind of, for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, that's great. That's great. Good practices, and using Slack, using email.
right.
Are you active on social media? Sort of communicating with your community as well, or is
I
that
have ramped
someone
that
else?
up too.
Okay.
I think that people who use social media really well would probably say I'm not that active yet, but I'm certainly more active than I was before.
Okay.
And so then what I would like to add, we Berkland do not have investors, but our clients, of course, do. And sometimes there's a tension between investors and clients and companies. But what I would say is now is the time to communicate more frequently, more openly with investors. They know it's serious, and so communicating clearly. In fact, First Round just put out a great article that summarized a bunch of articles. I was in the process of reading it right before this call. And one of the things they talked about is the opportunity here in a crisis like this is it often drives alignment. All the small petty stuff starts to fall away. And everybody knows how serious this is. And everybody's much more aligned than they used to be around this. So like communicating openly, honestly, frequently with investors, I think is super important right now.
That's great. Well, listen, I want to thank you, Jeff, and also Steve, for doing this with us today. I think all this is incredibly valuable information for a CEO or a CEO and their CFO to sit down together and just review and say, are we taking these steps? And I think this kind of thinking can be the difference between survival and not. I mean, these are good basic steps. Now, obviously, we're just trying to keep it to the very basics. But I think if you take these 5 steps, you're going to be in much better shape than if you don't, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks from me as well.